powerful earthquake struck off the coast of Sabah in the early hours of Monday. The 6.8 magnitude quake hit at 12:57 a.m.
What would you do if the ground started shaking beneath your feet at 1 in the morning, and nobody around you had ever felt anything like it before? That is exactly what happened to thousands of people in Malaysia on February 23, 2026. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake ripped through the waters off the coast of Sabah, rattling buildings, swinging ceiling lights, and sending sleepy residents scrambling out of bed in genuine fear. And the truly wild part? For Malaysia, a country that most people do not even put on their earthquake radar, this was one of the biggest seismic events recorded in over 100 years. Stick around, because this story gets a lot more interesting than just the shaking. The night Malaysia woke up shaking. It is just before 1 in the morning in Kota Kinabalu, Sabah, a coastal city in Malaysian Borneo that is better known for white sandy beaches, rainforest trekking, and lazy sunset cruises than for anything remotely geological. Hotel guests sleeping off a long day of island hopping, local families tucked into their beds, night shift workers going about their routines. Then, at exactly 12:57 a.m. local time, the ground starts to move. Ceiling fans begin to sway. Water in glasses sloshes sideways. Doors rattle in their frames. In some buildings, people heard a low, deep rumble first, almost like a heavy truck passing by, before the shaking kicked in. Social media absolutely exploded within minutes. Short phone clips of swinging light fixtures, voice notes of people whispering, "Did you feel that?" Anxious posts asking if anyone else just experienced what they just experienced. The shaking was felt not just in Sabah. Reports poured in from across Sarawak, the other large Malaysian state on Borneo, and from neighboring Brunei. Even residents in parts of Singapore, hundreds of kilometers away, said they felt a faint tremor. The fact that so many places felt it at the same time tells you something important. This was not a small local event. This was a big one. The question on everyone's lips that night was exactly how big. The numbers behind the shake. When the United States Geological Survey, commonly known as USGS, published its first data, the number that came out was 7.1. On the moment magnitude scale, that puts this earthquake firmly in the major category. To give you a sense of just how powerful that is, a magnitude 7.0 event releases roughly 32 times more energy than a magnitude 6.0 event. In other words, this was not just a little bigger than a moderate quake. It was in a completely different league. The epicenter was located offshore, in the South China Sea, roughly 55 kilometers north-northwest of a town called Kota Belud in Sabah, and less than 100 kilometers from Kota Kinabalu itself. That is not very far at all. In earthquake terms, having a magnitude 7.1 event less than 100 kilometers from your state capital is the kind of number that makes geologists sit up very straight in their chairs. Interestingly, Malaysia's own meteorological department, Met Malaysia, placed the magnitude slightly lower at 6.8, which is actually pretty normal. Different seismic networks use different instruments and calculation methods, so small differences in reported magnitudes are common in the hours immediately following a major event. Both agencies, however, agreed on the single most important factor that defined this earthquake, its extraordinary depth. And that depth is what makes this entire story so fascinating. 620 kilometers down, the deep secret. Here is where this earthquake goes from big news to genuinely jaw-dropping. The USGS reported the depth of this quake at approximately 619.8 kilometers below the Earth's surface. Read that again slowly. Nearly 620 kilometers underground. That is not a typo. Most earthquakes that we hear about in the news happen within the top 30 or so kilometers of the Earth's crust, the thin, brittle outer layer of the planet where tectonic plates interact and rocks snap under pressure. A quake at 620 kilometers is not happening in the crust at all. It is happening deep inside the Earth's mantle, that thick, incredibly hot layer of rock that sits between the crust and the core. At that depth, the pressure and temperature are so extreme that most rocks do not break in the traditional sense. They flow very slowly, like a very thick liquid over millions of years. So why did this earthquake happen at all? The answer involves something genuinely mind-bending called a subducted slab. Millions of years ago, ancient tectonic plates slowly sank, or subducted, beneath the region that is now Southeast Asia. These old, cold slabs of rock are still down there, deep in the mantle, slowly sinking and equilibrating. And occasionally, as one expert put it, there is clearly still at least a little seismic potential remaining at these great depths. The old slab remnant fractures under the incredible stress of its surroundings, releasing energy that travels all the way up through 620 kilometers of rock before it reaches the surface, as the shaking that those residents in Kota Kinabalu felt. Why depth saved the day? Now here is the part of this story where the science actually brings relief rather than panic. That extraordinary depth, 620 kilometers, is precisely the reason why this massive earthquake did not turn into a catastrophe. When an earthquake happens close to the surface, the energy has very little distance to travel before it reaches buildings, roads, and people. The shaking at the surface can be violent, high frequency, and absolutely devastating, the kind that topples concrete buildings in seconds. But when an earthquake originates at 620 kilometers depth, that seismic energy has to travel through an enormous amount of rock before it gets anywhere near the surface. All that rock absorbs energy, spreads it out, and essentially dampens the violent, destructive, high-frequency shaking. By the time the waves reach buildings in Kota Kinabalu, they are far less aggressive than those from a shallow quake of the same magnitude. Think of it like dropping a stone into a very deep lake versus a shallow puddle. Deep lake, the ripples at the edge are gentle. Shallow puddle, the splash goes everywhere and hard. The USGS impact models for this event came back with what scientists call a green alert, meaning the likelihood of severe damage or significant casualties was low, specifically because of the deep source. The Sabah Fire and Rescue Department confirmed no emergency calls related to the earthquake were received. Inspections at Kota Kinabalu International Airport, the Jesselton Point Ferry Terminal, and major beachfront hotels all found no structural damage. Ferries to nearby islands resumed normal service after brief precautionary checks. In short, massive earthquake, minimal damage. That is the remarkable outcome that depth delivered. No tsunami. And here is why. One of the very first things people search for after a big ocean earthquake is there a tsunami coming? For this event, the answer was a clear no, and the U.S. Tsunami Warning Center confirmed it quickly, which is exactly what you want to see in those terrifying first minutes after a major seismic event. The reason ties back to depth again. Tsunamis are almost always triggered by shallow earthquakes that physically move the seafloor up or down very suddenly. When a large section of seafloor lurches upward, it displaces an enormous volume of water above it, and that displaced water radiates outward as the long, fast, deadly waves we call tsunamis. For that displacement to happen, the earthquake needs to be close to the seafloor, usually less than 70 kilometers deep. An earthquake at 620 kilometers depth does not produce that sudden, dramatic seafloor movement. The energy release is happening so far down in the mantle that by the time any motion reaches the seafloor, it is greatly diffused. Met Malaysia formally confirmed there was no tsunami threat to Malaysia. The U.S. Tsunami Warning Center issued an information statement for its coverage area. No warning, no advisory, no watch, no threat. For the residents of Sabah and for coastal communities across the region, that confirmation brought enormous relief on what was already a startling night. The last time something this big hit Malaysia. To really appreciate how rare and remarkable this earthquake was, you need some historical perspective. Malaysia is not a country people associate with powerful earthquakes. It is not Japan, not Indonesia, not the Philippines. It sits away from the most intense plate boundaries in the region, the Sunda Trench to the west and southwest, and the Philippine Trench to the east. For most of its modern history, Malaysia has experienced only mild tremors, mostly felt from large earthquakes happening in Sumatra or further away. Historical earthquake data going back to 1900 shows that the strongest earthquake near Malaysia in the past 126 years before this event was a magnitude 6.8 that struck on April 19, 1923, more than a century ago. No earthquake of magnitude 6.0 or greater had been recorded near Malaysia in the decade before this event. The strongest quake in the past 10 years near the country was only a 5.6 recorded in 2017. So when a magnitude 7.1 emerges, it genuinely stands out as one of the most powerful events ever instrumentally recorded in or near the country. Experts noted that this event surpassed, in raw magnitude, even the 2015 Ranau earthquake, a shallow, destructive quake that killed several climbers on Mount Kinabalu and cracked roads and buildings in Sabah. So yes, when the title says, "First time in over a century," that is grounded in the actual historical record. This was a seismic exclamation mark in a country that rarely gets earthquakes anywhere near this size, what Malaysia's tectonic setting actually looks like. Most people picture Southeast Asia's earthquake risk as being concentrated in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan. And they are largely right. These countries sit on, or very close to some of the world's most active plate boundaries and subduction zones. But Malaysia's tectonic story is more subtle and more interesting than most people realize. Malaysia sits on the Sundaland Block, a stable continental core of Southeast Asia. The Sunda Plate, on which Malaysia rests, is being squeezed and pushed from multiple directions. The Indian-Australian Plate moves northward at about 7 centimeters per year. The Philippine-Caroline Pacific Plate pushes westward at roughly 10 centimeters per year. These plate motions generate tremendous stress in the surrounding region, and Sabah, sitting at the northeastern edge of Borneo, is closer to these active boundaries than peninsular Malaysia. Sabah itself lies on the outer edge of Southeast Asia's complex tectonic jigsaw, where remnants of old subducted ocean plates sit deep in the mantle beneath it. That is precisely why the February 2026 earthquake happened where it did. A deeply buried slab remnant, possibly from the ancient Proto-South China Sea Plate that subducted millions of years ago, still harboring enough stress to generate a magnitude 7.1 event at depth. Seismologists have noted that these deep earthquakes in the Borneo region are so rare that they do not map out any clear structural pattern, which means every single one is scientifically precious. Each event adds another data point to our understanding of what is still happening in the deep interior beneath this island. How people actually experienced it. Science is important, but let us also talk about what it actually felt like to be there that night. Because no amount of technical explanation fully captures the experience of being woken up at 1 in the morning by the ground moving under you in a country where that simply does not happen very often. Residents across Sabah describe the sensation as ranging from a gentle swaying to a more noticeable, unsettling horizontal movement that lasted between 5 and 10 seconds. One person in Tuaran, about 73 kilometers from the epicenter, described feeling a weak but unmistakable shaking while lying in bed. In Kudat, closer to the epicenter, people reported vibrations strong enough to make doors visibly move. A resident in Penampang, nearly 1,700 kilometers from the epicenter in map terms, though that seems unlikely. This was likely a misreport of distance, described moderate sideways swinging, and said it was their first ever earthquake experience. It was terrifying, they wrote on a community report page. In Brunei's capital, Bandar Seri Begawan, about 261 kilometers from the epicenter, residents reported light shaking, brief single lateral movements lasting just a few seconds. And in Singapore, over 1,500 kilometers away, Some residents in eastern districts reported feeling a very faint tremor, posting on Reddit with genuine surprise. The fact that this deep earthquake was felt across such a vast area, from northern Borneo all the way to Singapore, speaks to how much seismic energy a magnitude 7.1 event releases, even when that energy starts from 620 kilometers underground. It is a reminder that the Earth's interior is vast, but not infinitely insulating. What the experts and scientists are saying. When a major earthquake strikes an unusual location, the seismology community pays close attention. And the February 2026 Sabah earthquake drew genuine scientific interest, not just because of its size, but because of what it might tell us about what is happening in the deep earth beneath Southeast Asia. Researchers who study deep-focus earthquakes noted that events like this one occur within what are called subducting slabs, ancient sections of ocean crust that sank into the mantle and continue to slowly descend. These old, cold slabs behave differently from the hot surrounding mantle rock. They are denser, stiffer, and under enormous stress. The leading hypothesis for how these deep earthquakes actually occur is something called transformational faulting, a process where extreme pressure drives sudden, rapid mineral phase changes inside the slab, causing a runaway effect that generates a rupture even at depths where most rocks would normally just flow slowly. Scientists emphasized that the depth here is the critical factor in almost every interpretation of this event. As one analysis put it plainly, a deep earthquake like this one is mainly an intellectual stimulator and not a societal devastator. That might sound like dry academic language, but it is actually a deeply reassuring statement. It means the Earth did something dramatic and scientifically remarkable, and humans, thankfully, mostly just felt a wobble rather than a catastrophe. Researchers are expected to continue refining the magnitude, depth, and epicenter data as more seismic readings come in from monitoring stations across the region. The 2015 Ranau earthquake, Malaysia's painful recent memory. To understand why this 2026 earthquake is getting so much attention, it helps to go back to 2015, the last time a powerful earthquake made headlines in Malaysia. On June 5, 2015, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck near Ranau in Sabah, at a very shallow depth of just about 10 kilometers. That is the opposite extreme from the 2026 event. Shallow, close, and violent. The Ranau earthquake was devastating in its own limited but heartbreaking way. It struck while climbers were descending Mount Kinabalu, one of Southeast Asia's most beloved peaks, and triggered rock slides and a landslide on the mountain. 18 people died, most of them school children on an outdoor education trip. Roads cracked, buildings were damaged. It was a sobering wake-up call for a country that had largely operated without building codes designed specifically to withstand seismic stress. The contrast between 2015 and 2026 is striking and instructive. The Ranau quake was only a 6.0, smaller in magnitude than the 2026 event, but it was shallow and it killed people. The 2026 quake was a 7.1, significantly more powerful, but it was so deep that no one died and almost nothing broke. Same region of Sabah, dramatically different outcomes, entirely because of one factor: depth. Seismologists noted that the two events occurred very close to each other geographically, but were actually more than 600 kilometers apart in terms of their true three-dimensional distance underground. That single fact tells you everything about how geology can turn a potential disaster into just a really scary Tuesday morning. Malaysia's earthquake preparedness. How ready is the country? One of the bigger questions raised by an event like this is, how prepared is Malaysia for a serious earthquake threat? And the answer, if we are being direct, is that there is real room for improvement, though the country has made meaningful progress since 2015. Before the Ranau earthquake, Malaysia had no national seismic building code. After it, the government worked to develop a national seismic hazard map, a seismic building code, and planning guidelines for high-risk earthquake areas. But researchers who study earthquake hazard in Malaysia have pointed out that there is still a significant gap. There is a shortage of seismic monitoring stations, limited geological and geotechnical data, a lack of trained human resources in earthquake science, and, critically, limited public awareness about what to do when a quake strikes. Malaysia's building stock is largely designed with tropical storms, wind loads, and heat in mind. Seismic resistance has historically been an afterthought, especially in older buildings. Engineers who analyzed the 2026 earthquake noted that the event essentially served as a free, full-scale structural test of buildings across Sabah, and that modern reinforced concrete structures appeared to hold up well. But they also flagged that the event should prompt a serious review of design standards for taller buildings and critical infrastructure. If a future earthquake of similar magnitude were shallower, the picture could look very different. The February 2026 earthquake was a warning gift, one that caused no casualties but delivered a very clear message. What is Magempa and how did Malaysia track this? When the earthquake hit, one of the most important things that happened in the following minutes was not in the news headlines, it was in the data. Malaysia's meteorological department operates a system called Magempa, which is a real-time seismic monitoring and shake map tool designed specifically to give Malaysians fast, detailed information about earthquake events across the country and surrounding region. The Magempa platform publishes information on earthquake location, magnitude, depth, and estimated ground shaking intensity across different areas. In the hours after the February 2026 event, the department used this platform to communicate official updates to the public, including the all-important confirmation that there was no tsunami threat. For a population that was waking up confused and scared at 1 in the morning, having a clear official government-run source of real-time earthquake data is genuinely invaluable. Malaysia also benefits from global monitoring. The USGS Global Earthquake Monitoring Network, operated from the United States, had preliminary data on this event within minutes of it occurring. The Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, IRIS, and networks across the region all contributed to rapid analysis. This multi-layered approach to earthquake monitoring, combining national tools like Magempa with international networks, is exactly the kind of infrastructure that allows authorities to move quickly from what just happened to here is what it means and here is whether you need to worry. The tourism angle. What happened to Sabah's visitors? Here is a detail that did not make every headline but is genuinely interesting. Sabah is one of Southeast Asia's most rapidly growing tourism destinations. Kota Kinabalu, the state capital, is packed with hotels. The surrounding waters host some of the world's most celebrated dive sites: Sipadan, Mabul, Kapalai. Every week, thousands of tourists from across Asia and beyond are sleeping in guest houses, beach resorts, and budget hostels across northern Borneo. When a magnitude 7.1 earthquake strikes less than 100 kilometers offshore at 1 in the morning, tourists wake up to swaying buildings in a country they may never have associated with seismic risk. According to reports, the psychological impact on visitors was notable, even if the physical damage was essentially zero. Tourism authorities acknowledged that the shaking was alarming, particularly for first-time visitors who had no frame of reference for what a tremor feels like. Clips and posts from tourists circulated rapidly across social media platforms. Within hours, however, state officials confirmed that Kota Kinabalu International Airport had sustained no structural damage and was operating normally. Ferries to the famous islands, Gaya, Sapi, Manukan, resumed normal schedules after brief but thorough precautionary checks. Hotels reported no injuries. The tourism industry in Sabah was shaken in the psychological sense, but physically, it held. Travel advisories were not issued. Within days, things were back to normal on the surface. But for many visitors, This was their first and most memorable brush with the reality that Southeast Asia sits on an incredibly active piece of the planet's crust. Deep earthquakes, the rarest and strangest kind. Most people know two things about earthquakes. They shake the ground and they happen at fault lines. But deep focus earthquakes, like the one that struck Malaysia in February 2026, operate by completely different rules, and they are genuinely one of the more mysterious phenomena in all of Earth science. For an earthquake to happen, you need rocks that are cold and brittle enough to break rather than slowly deform. Near the surface, those conditions are common, but as you go deeper, rocks get hotter and softer. By the time you reach 100 kilometers depth, most rocks are too warm and ductile to generate the kind of sudden fracture that produces an earthquake. So how on earth, literally, can a quake happen at 620 kilometers? The answer, scientists believe, involves extreme pressure forcing sudden changes in the crystal structure of minerals. Olivine, a common mineral in the Earth's mantle, transforms into different crystal arrangements as pressure increases with depth. First into wadsleyite at around 410 kilometers, then ringwoodite at 520 kilometers, then into different minerals entirely at around 660 kilometers. Scientists think these sudden mineral phase transitions can trigger a kind of chain reaction fracturing, creating the deep earthquake. This process is still actively debated among geologists, and there is a lot of room for new discoveries. Every deep quake adds a little more data to an incomplete picture. Deep earthquakes are fascinating because they are so rare, so hard to study, and so different from the shallow quakes that fill the news. They tend to be widely felt over huge areas because deep seismic waves travel more efficiently through the Earth. They rarely cause significant surface damage, and they hint at the extraordinary ancient geological processes happening in the deep interior of our planet. Processes that most of us will never see, never feel, and rarely even think about. What happens next? Aftershocks, monitoring, and the big picture. After any major earthquake, one of the most common and reasonable questions is, will there be aftershocks? For deep focus earthquakes, the answer is that aftershock sequences tend to be smaller and less frequent than those following shallow quakes of similar magnitude. That is partly because deep earthquakes occur in the mantle, where the rock behaves differently from crustal rock, and partly because the physical mechanism driving deep quakes does not always produce the same cascading stress changes that generate extended aftershock sequences near the surface. That said, Met Malaysia and other regional agencies confirmed they would continue monitoring conditions following the event. In the days after a magnitude 7.1 earthquake, ongoing monitoring is simply responsible practice, even if the deep focus reduces the likely risk. The USGS and other international seismic networks continued to refine the event's parameters, as is standard. Minor adjustments to reported magnitude and depth are normal as more seismic stations report in and more sophisticated analysis is completed. From a bigger picture perspective, this earthquake is a reminder that the Earth beneath Malaysia and beneath all of Southeast Asia is anything but static. Ancient slabs of oceanic crust are still sinking through the mantle, still releasing energy, still shaping the slow geological story of the region. Malaysia has been lucky that most of its damaging earthquake risk comes from moderate, shallow events, not from massive, deep ones. But events like February 2026 remind seismologists, engineers, and policymakers that the ground under Sabah holds surprises. More investment in monitoring, more seismic-resistant building design, and more public education about earthquake safety are not just good ideas. They are genuinely necessary steps for a country that sits within reach of one of the most tectonically active regions on the planet. On February 23, 2026, a powerful 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck off Sabah, Malaysia, the strongest near the country in over a century. Felt across Borneo to Singapore, it caused no deaths or major damage because it originated 620 kilometers deep. Malaysia was fortunate, but will that luck last? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did you feel this earthquake? And do you think Malaysia is doing enough to prepare for future seismic events?